Hey guys, welcome back. Now this is a little late for our weekly assignment, but I had a perfect case study come in this week, and it was a Toyota with a starter issue. So I implemented a lot of the training that we did early on in the Automotive Weekly Waveforms, where we connected multiple channels and we kept adding channels, and I'll cover that stuff on the screen right here. I do have the starter in my hand so we can take it apart and see what actually failed once we get to that point. But on our screen, this was the first attempt after I got the scope hooked up of actually starting up the vehicle. And we can see here down at the bottom is my amperage. It jumps up. We see, an amperage peak as the engine starts turning over. We see a little bit of noise here at the beginning. We see our engine rotations and it fires up. Our amperage goes negative as that alternator starts charging. So all of that looks pretty good, right? Well, we can look at this waveform and we can see a lot of information. So let's go ahead and look and see what our battery was doing. So here at the beginning, we can drop a cursor down. Now I had started this vehicle multiple times before I hooked the scope up, so the battery was a little discharged. We started at 12.28. So we want to see like 12.6 on a fully charged battery. But man, right here, we see all kinds of noise as that starter engages and before it even starts spinning. And then once it started spinning, we dropped down to around 8 volts. So not terrible. I've seen a lot worse. Let me zoom out just a little bit and we can see what we were at when the engine was actually spinning over. And we'll get kind of an average there. So 10.45 volts as the engine's turning over. That's still good in my book. As long as I'm above 9.6 as the engine's turning over, I'm not too concerned about it. I don't like the big drop to be below 7 volts. Computers don't like that. I even prefer them above 8, but it doesn't always happen, especially when you're measuring with the scope. Sometimes you get that real quick momentary dropout. The computers and stuff have capacitors in them that they're supposed to stay powered up even if that voltage drops down below that point for a split second, but it doesn't always happen, especially on Chryslers. If they drop below 9 volts, a lot of times they'll reset the computer. So that looks fairly good. The battery looks okay. Let's go ahead and zoom back out. Now on this vehicle, it was fairly easy to get to the wire on the other side of the solenoid. Of course, the boot tore when I tried taking it off, but it doesn't matter at this point because the starter had to be replaced. I hooked an alligator clamp, and that's what this red lead is. That is connected on the back side of the starter. Now, I don't know if I showed that in any of our testing we had done so far, but since I had it available to me, on this one was easy to access, I connected to it because I figured that it would show our problem. The green is going to be our solenoid command. That is when we turn the key, the small wire to the starter that engages the solenoid. And then the yellow is the amperage like I mentioned before. Let's go ahead and zoom in to the part where this starter first starts engaging. When we turn the key to the crank position and that solenoid actually has to come in contact with the contacts before the starter can actually start spinning over. And that's right here at the beginning of this green trace. Now I know I have everything kind of shrunk down here. We can zoom in on that. And we can throw a cursor. We can see that we're at 0 volts approximately when I don't have the key in the crank position. That's what we want to see. I'm not cranking that engine over yet, so we should be seeing 0 volts. And then when the key actually gets to that crank position, we jump up to 12 volts. Now there's a little hiccup here. There's probably a little bit of arcing when I turn that key to the crank position. I don't think this vehicle has a start relay, but even if it did, we might see a little hiccup like that. We're looking at, a very, very small amount of time. Even if that relay contact is closing, we might see a little bit of a glitch. But this is probably just for me turning the key to the on position. As those contacts come in line, we might have a little fluctuation of voltage there. But at that point, the starter should be engaged. And then if we throw some time cursors up, it takes a little bit for that solenoid to start moving and travel the distance to engage the starter pinion, the small gear on the starter. It has to push that into the flywheel. And then at that point, around the same time that it gets pushed into the flywheel, the 2 starter contacts connect and that starter starts spinning over and turning over the engine. So at that point right here, when I first see power coming out the other side of the starter, we're looking at 20 milliseconds. So a fairly short amount of time. But if we zoom in right here, now this vehicle was brought in for an intermittent no start. Now the customer said that it doesn't do anything at all. When I got it to act up, it did do something. We heard a little bit of a click, but I didn't get it to act up on this attempt at starting it over. But we can still see some telltale signs of failure. All of this up and down movement, that starter solenoid is already engaged, and those contacts should be closed. But we are seeing all kinds of disconnects here. It jumps up to battery voltage. Let me throw a red cursor on there just to show you guys where battery voltage is. So that cursor is at a little over 11 volts. We should be seeing battery voltage on the other side of this solenoid over here going into the starter motor, because I've already engaged the solenoid. So we should have full battery power there, but we don't. It disconnects, it re-engages, it disconnects, it re-engages. Now all this is happening in a very short amount of time as well. And then right down here, boom, it looks happy. It engages, it sends full power to the starter and starts cranking over. But what about when the vehicle didn't start? I have a capture. I started and stopped this vehicle numerous times. Just start up, shut off, start up, shut off. Even before I scoped it, I did that. And right over here is when the vehicle didn't start. So I know it's a little hard to see. Let me minimize some of this stuff here. So our green trace, we went from 0 volts to battery voltage. You know, not quite 12 volts once we engaged, because we're pulling the battery down a little bit, but we are commanding that starter to start. Battery voltage, let's look at that. Make sure we have good battery voltage. Now we should, because we had 12 volts at the solenoid, but we have 11.5 volts. That's pretty good. That should be enough to start the vehicle, right? Let's look at our red trace. Now this is the trace on the other side of the solenoid. We should have power there. We see a little bit of noise and then nothing. We have no power. So it jumped up, you know, to battery voltage a couple times. We had some noise. And keep in mind, I'm still holding the vehicle in the crank position, but we have 0 voltage going to our starter. Now, if you guys see this, if you have the ability to test this, whether it's a Denso starter like this that has, you know, the battery coming in here, we have the solenoid inside here, and then we have the output from the solenoid to the starter. If you can get to this terminal, great. I tore the boot. It was kind of dried out, so it tore real easy. So, you know, that's a bad thing if you're trying to do this. If you're working on a conventional starter on your GMs and Fords and 90% of all the other vehicles that don't have a Denso starter or a gear reduction starter, they're gonna have 2 solenoids on the back, or 2 studs on the back. The top one is normally your battery input. The one at the bottom normally has a short cable, copper cable like this one does, going into the starter motor housing. And those are the 2 that you're gonna hook up. One should be B+, the other one is going to be power going to the starter motor. So just by doing this test, I 100% confirmed that, okay, I have a bad solenoid on this starter. Now, this was on a Toyota Camry. I don't know, I did put the mileage in. 210,000 miles. The customer decided that he didn't want the starter contacts replaced. He wanted us to put a new starter in. So at this point, you're like, okay, well, this starter's lasted 200,000 miles. What kind of starter am I going to put in? And luckily, we were able to find a Nippon Denso starter. It was remanufactured in the USA. Everything looked perfect. My second choice would have been a Toyota starter. And then if none of those were available, I would have rather put contacts in this starter before putting another brand aftermarket starter in. We've just had too many issues. So now that I put a new starter in, confirmed everything was perfect. I thought I had a capture on here, but didn't find it. No, I do have it. Now keep in mind, sometimes a new starter may have a little bit of noise until it gets broken in. They put new brushes in there, new contacts. So all the same connections that we had before. And we do see a little bit more noise here at the end when the alternator kicks in. I'm not sure if, you know, if I had a bad ground or what, but we see no hesitation at the beginning of this. Now, if we zoom way in, we see a small little hiccup here as those contacts, as the key is being turned, a little bit of voltage fluctuation there, but that's not in the contacts. Let me zoom back out and we'll go to where the contacts engage. Keep in mind our red is the voltage going out of that starter, or out of the solenoid into the starter motor. We see a few fluctuations as that contact fully seats. There might be some arcing at first, and then once it makes contact, we see amperage go through it and everything looks perfectly fine. And as this fully breaks in, I would expect that to go down a little bit. You always see it a little more because the contacts may not be 100% even. So, prove that the part that we put on there was good. And most of this noise, I think, is when that starter disengages and winds down. I'm actually connected, since I'm connected at the starter motor, those brushes, since they're not fully broken in, I will get a little bit of additional noise. If I put a mild filter on this, it would look like all the other captures that we've had, where we see that trickle of voltage coming down off the solenoid. And since I'm connected to the starter motor itself, we'll see that same pattern where it slopes off as that starter is continuing to wind down from that engagement. So let's get off the scope screen. We'll take this starter apart and I'll show you what happened inside of this thing to cause a failure. Okay, if you've never rebuilt a Toyota starter before, same concept goes for pretty much any vehicle that uses the Nip and Denso starter that looks like this, including the Cummins diesel engines. So we have the starter solenoid up here. It's kind of a squarish pattern. I guess there's 5 sides there, so pentagon pattern there. We have the input, we have our solenoid control wire, and we have our output going to the starter motor. What we want to do is we want to take this apart and we can service the contacts that are inside of this starter. So to do that, there's 3 screws on the back, and that'll let us take the solenoid plunger out, and there's a spring in there, and then we can inspect the contacts. Now, most vehicles, you can't really get to this without removing the starter from the vehicle, but this Toyota, even the starter was only like a half-hour job, so not a major big deal. Yeah, I'm just ripping this out of my way. That's a little drain for it, but since I'm not putting this back together, it doesn't really matter much if I break some of that stuff. If you're servicing this for a customer, you're going to want to leave some of that stuff intact, unless you buy a service kit that comes with new vents. So we got 3 screws on the back. Now this one, they were 7mm, but a lot of them that I've taken apart are 8mm bolts. We'll take this plate off. There's a gasket as well. We'll set that aside. And now we can pull this plunger out. Now this plunger is actually what gets sucked in when we engage the solenoid. There's a winding of wires in here, a coil that creates a magnetic field, and this plunger is made out of metal. It sucks it in there, and then right here on this outer edge is a copper or brass contact ring. And what it does is when it gets slammed into the bottom of this, it makes contact or bridges the other 2 contacts that are in here to let the power pass through from the battery to the starter motor. Now, looking at this thing, it is kind of a mess. So we can see all kinds of pitting and scarring. If we flip it to the side, try to keep you guys in focus here, you can sometimes see a lip on this contact. Now, if you're just changing the contacts in the starter motor itself, then you're going to want to file this area back down flat. They do make some service kits online that you can get the new plunger as well. And then there's a spring that lets it return, after you disengage the starter. And then this long rod, let me stick it in there without the spring. When I push in on that, you can see that starter pinion engage. Some call it the Bendix, but as that sticks out, it engages into the teeth of the flywheel, and once it starts spinning, it spins the engine over. Now there's a one-way clutch built into this, so it'll freewheel that way. So when you turn the engine over and you're holding the key in the crank position, the engine fires up and you haven't let off the key yet. as that engine speeds up rapidly, instead of really spinning this starter fast, you know, this can freewheel a little bit. But it's really, really hard to turn the other way because I'm actually turning over the starter motor, and there is a gear reduction because you can see the pinion comes out the top here and my motor's down there. So there's some gear to gear action going on down here that gives this starter a little more torque. And some of the Toyotas, there's even, you know, 3 or 4 options of starters on what the output is. If you're in colder climates, there'll be a bigger starter option. So let's pull this solenoid out and look down in the starter. And surprisingly, and it's not surprising to me because I've had a lot of these apart, you always see the B+ input solenoid wear out the most. So let me see if I can get a good view of this for you guys. So we have 2 contacts inside of there, horseshoe shaped pieces. We notice that the input side over here has a bigger contact surface, and then the output is a smaller one. There's almost no wear at all on the output, but the inside, or the input one, is completely fried. And I think that just has to do with where the arcing happens as that piece closes. And if the input wears out more, it's going to engage this side first and then touch down on the input. And as it does that, it's going to, you know, rapidly or accelerate the wear on the contact on this one side, and this side's not going to see as much throughout the life. Now, because there are so many different starters out there that use different contacts, there are several different ones. Like this is an offset contact, but it's a long contact, but it's offset to one side. They make them that are offset to the other side. Some starters have the big long contact on both sides. Some have the small contacts on both sides. So keeping an arrangement of these, you have to keep quite a few part numbers, and they're getting a little more difficult to get a complete assembly for. You can buy them specific for a vehicle online if you so choose. So let's go ahead and pull the contacts out. Now, in order to do this, we have to take the nuts off of both sides. Now, the one side over here still has a nut holding this wire on that goes to the starter motor. The other side, I already took the first nut off to get the battery cable unhooked. So we'll take this wire off and kind of lay it off to the side. I think those jump up to a 14 maybe. Take that one off as well. And then we have to push this stud into the starter. And we want to be careful because down inside the starter, we zoom back in here again, we have a couple of wires that are really small and easy to break. From this input, there are 2 copper wires coming down, and then there's a single copper wire that comes over here and bridges onto this contact. So the 2 on this side, we're not going to be really touching as we take this stud out. They're not connected to that stud. We just have to watch this single contact on this side, and that goes to the starter solenoid pull-in coil. Okay, so now that I have the bolt out of the starter, we need to slide that contact out. Now, that wire comes up and there's a little plate here. Just gonna cautiously move that out of my way and get the contact out. Now it's just this, you know, tiny little piece of metal, and it does have some wear on it. So we can see right here, there's a little bit of wear from the contact, but it's very minimal. So if this is my personal vehicle and I only had, you know, I couldn't replace all the contacts, or if the kit I had the wrong contacts, I would probably just file this one back flat and ship it. If it's a customer vehicle and we're putting contacts in it, we'll make sure that we're replacing all the contacts with new parts. So now we're going to take the bolt out of the input contact. It looks like the whole thing's going to come apart. So now I have this, you know, stack of parts here. We'll just push, we'll take that piece of plastic or paper off of there. We have a plastic insulator and an O-ring, and then my contact is stuck on the bolt. Quick little tap. Now this contact is completely shot. So you can see here on the edge, there is almost no material left. It's almost completely wore through. That contact has gone through a lot of startups over the last 200,000 miles. So if we replace this contact with a new contact, we could probably, get quite a good service life out of this starter, even possibly another 100,000 miles. So that's it on the Nippon Denso starter contacts. I figured since I had a case study real similar to what we've been working on in the Facebook group, I would go ahead and share it with you guys. And since it's a starter that I can take apart and show you guys the failure, that was even better. So now I'll have to put this thing back together so I can send it in as a core, but at least it's a simple starter to work on. If you guys have any questions or comments, put those down below. I'll try to get back to you as quick as I can. If you are interested about the Facebook group, if you haven't heard about it, I'll put a link to that down below as well. Every week I post up a video of how to perform a certain scope test, and then participants in the group will perform that test sometime during the week and then take a picture of their waveform capture, put it up on Facebook, and we'll do a live stream talking about the captures that people have uploaded. So it's kind of fun, it's interactive, and it gets us to grab the scope and use it at least once a week if you guys aren't currently using it that often, or if you're still learning how to use the scope. We started off with some basic testing and we're getting a little more advanced and building on the tests that we're doing. And we're not jumping straight into big advanced things. We might build on a test for a little bit and then we start on a new section and we go back to the basics and we keep it simple, and then we build upon that section as well. So there'll be a link to that down below. If you guys enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more videos like this, subscribe, click the bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.